Good morning. My name is Ray Poynter, and I'm going to be talking to you about understanding the role of data in presentations. And I think the first thing I want to talk about is how there's a spectrum, a real difference of views. And at one end, we'd have somebody like Tufty, who is really looking to give the audience the data to allow them to analyze it. His ideal of a perfect presentation is really a typewritten handout where the audience can spend 10 or 15 minutes reading the data, the charts, thinking about it, and then moving on to the substance of the presentation. At the other extreme end, we would get somebody like Seth Godin, who says, only use a chart in a presentation to make a point. If proving some deep insight or giving people data to draw their own conclusions, don't put it in a presentation. We can almost come back to a very, very basic difference in what Tufty and Godin are trying to do. Tufty is trying to share information, so you learn something different by attending his presentation. Seth Godin is trying to change your mind. He wants you to come out of the presentation a different person with a different opinion. If you're not there to make a difference, why are you there? Is the sort of thing that he would argue. And almost everything we do as market researchers is going to be somewhere on the spectrum between these 2 points. Going back to Seth for a moment, he makes a really good point, however, about most market research presentations. Every slide should tell a single story. We should know what the story is. We shouldn't have multiple stories on the same slide. Audiences have less attention maybe than they used to have. They've got other pressing things on their mind. So we really need to tell the story. And here's a great example of how he set about that looking at coal. Now, the story here, of course, is that coal is a lot more dangerous than nuclear power. Now, we can argue with the background and the information and the various things that went into it, but he's making his point here. There are no numbers on that page. The sizes are proportional. They fit the data properly. In fact, here's an example of the underlying data. And if Tufty were presenting this, he would object to even this level of data because he would want to be able to judge as a member of the audience, well, what do we mean by deaths caused by? What exactly are we doing about, say, Chernobyl? Are we taking this estimate of deaths or this estimate of deaths or this estimate of deaths? So he would want all of that information, whereas Seth Godin is saying, no, look here, here's the big picture I'm leaving in your mind. When people talk about presenting data, they will very often come back to some of the TED videos and Hans Rosling, who's a wonderful presenter of information. And they will talk about how he uses the Gapminder software, and he conveys a lot of detailed data and information when he's talking about it. He's talking about GDP and mortality rates. But actually, I urge you to go and have a look at the video again. Those of you who have never seen it, look at it for the first time. But those of you who have seen it, go and have a look at it again. Because what you notice is that he hits the play button. Once that this presentation about GDP per capita, how much money people have, and mortality, how much they're dying in the first year of birth, he is committed to a run. He's not even at the computer. It is running through. So it's a pre-scripted demonstration. And if we look at what's going on back in 1873, which is just one of the screen grabs I did, very few countries have data. By 1959, we see there's a lot more data. We see there's a dispersion. The size of those bubbles is relevant to population size, but there are no numbers on the page beyond that. And what he's just talking about there is the data has become available for China and for India, and what we can see is that they have a bad mortality and that they have quite low income per capita. Then he goes on to talk in a very animated way about under Mao Zedong, children started to live longer, so we can see the big red circle for China moving up, and then Mao Zedong died and he claps his hands. Then Xiaoping comes in and they started to get money, and you can see how India is moving up to the top right and China is moving up to the top right. So he is talking a story. He's not talking data. He has done a lot of thinking about data. He has a massive amount of data available to him. But what he's actually conveying to the audience is a story, and this is supporting the story. He's not actually conveying the data, he's using the data to support his story. And this idea that it's simply a picture is, I think, better described by this somewhat humorous slide I'm about to display than almost any other. Because when we look at a pie chart, we can't really take in real meaning. We can do things like this. Oh yes, most of the chart looks like Pac-Man, and a bit of the chart doesn't look like Pac-Man. And a pie chart can work at that level. A chart can work at that level. It's unlikely to work at the level of detailed numbers. So what do we really mean by data? Well, quantitative researchers tend to be hung up about numbers, but those with a more qualitative, particularly like an ethnographic background, will know that almost everything we've collected is data. The photographs, the jottings, sitting around the table working with colleagues and the produced scribblings from those are data, secondary resources are data. So we're pulling all that information together. And certainly, if we're doing analysis, that implies data. There is a major role for data in the analysis process. And this brings us back to this point about when we get to the presentation, are we trying to share information with the audience, the sort of the Tufty position, or are we just trying to convey a story, the God in vision? And you're going to see a presentation in a few minutes by Tom de Rijk, and he's going to be talking about workshops. And in a workshop, you can convey information. It's more like a Tufty situation. You want people to discover it, but I don't want to steal too much of Tom's thunder. Similarly, Chris and Ken are going to be talking about dashboards and interactive reporting. Again, in these situations, you are sharing information and people make the discoveries. But what about the standard 30-minute market research debrief? Perhaps with some senior managers in the room who have got attention deficit syndrome and who want the top findings quickly but want to make sure that it's right. Well, we think about data then, and we can think about it as the lamppost to the drunken man. It's providing illumination and support. And we need to think about the balance between how much those numbers are there to provide illumination and how much they are simply there to support the researcher and the credibility of the situation. So what is the role of the data within that context? Well, the first is, and this really comes back to the support factor, to reassure the client. We say we've got n equals 1,000. At that point, the client stops worrying about the sample size. We might show them several numbers related to the demographics, at which point we hope the client stops worrying about the demographics. Actually, it's usually enough to say it's nationally rep, or it is to your normal sample spec, or it is properly described, or whatever is the right phrase, because that's actually what the client usually wants to know. At a senior level, have we talked, is there anything I should worry about? Not have we talked to the right people, have we used the right questions? Turn that around. They want to know, is there anything I should worry about? And once you've conveyed the message, no, there's nothing you need to worry about, you can move on. Then we have data that comes through as part of the story. So segment one's a high spending, technology driven and prefers power to style. And to an extent, we are going to use some numbers, or we're going to use some charts, or we're going to use some graphs or some shading or something to convey this high spendiness and this technology. We don't expect the client to memorize that, to learn it and take it away. Those are simply part of the narrative theme that we're using to explain the story. But then there is information we do want them to take away, actual facts. So the market can be usually divided into 4 segments. And these 2 segments are your best target for this project. We want them to remember the 4, and we want them to remember the 2, and have those as numbers that they can use in the next discussion. So we've got numbers to reassure, that's the support. We have numbers really as part of the illumination. They're just part of the story. And then we have the small number, and it really needs to be a small number of key takeaway pieces of information. One of the real problems with market research presentations, especially the 30-minute ones, Gar Reynolds has talked about it, is the sligements problem. Sligements is a word, a portmanteau word, created by combining the word slides and documents. Is that deck supposed to be an engaging 30-minute presentation that's going to excite senior management, that's going to inform them, that's going to really show them the main message, or is it a takeaway document that allows people to pull the information from it at a later stage? And it's pretty much an impossible task. One of the things that I've started doing is a slight corruption of a Japanese word called nemawashi, which is originally a phrase of going around the roots, which meant talking to people and establishing what you needed to do. And the way I use it is, step one, deal with the validation and the evidence beforehand. So I will often have a webinar or a go-to meeting with the insight manager and anybody else from the client team who is terribly numbers focused. And we will go through the sample spec, we'll go through what do we mean by statistical significance, we will go through the background data, we will go through alternatives, we will go through the number of things that are going to be displayed in that meeting with people who are interested in those things. So we're having a meeting really that's more like a Tufty meeting. Then we get to the debrief, and now I'm going much more in the Seth Godin sort of direction, and I will start it with, right, I hope you senior managers don't mind, but we won't be showing you all the background details because we've had a really intense meeting with your insight manager, and I have to say she gave me a really hard time, but I think we've got through all the details. You've got a tough cookie there, so she's happy because we've paid her a compliment. The senior execs are happy because they're not going to have to go through the details, and I'm happy because I actually do want to talk about those details to somebody, but I want to talk about them to somebody who understands and cares about them. Afterwards, I'm going to supply reference information. Now, that might be a what-if model. It might be sets of tables. Increasingly, I'm finding that I'm supplying a report afterwards. From about 1985 to about 2005, I hardly wrote a report. But now I'm finding I'm beginning to write short reports after projects because it creates a much more useful go-to reference for the client. So just a few brief tips on what I think you can do in the debrief situation. Minimize the numbers. So the number of numbers. Go through and count how many numbers you've got in the document. Can you get it under 30? Can you get it under 20? Can you get it under 10 in the whole document? Minimize the number of digits. I mean, I'm sick and tired of seeing presentations where people have got a sample size of 100 and they talk about something male versus female. Now we know that's plus or minus 10%, and they go, well, this is 10.67 and this one is 21.35. 21.35, which is, but it's plus or minus 10. That's just spurious accuracy. Most humans can only deal with 2 or 3 significant digits. So keep truncating those digits back. Express all the millions, just round them into millions or round them into thousands. Take them out of decimal places and into indices if you can. Just minimize the number of digits. Come back to this Seth Godin point that in the debrief, every slide tells one story, which means the chart has to tell one story and the chart has to tell the same story as the rest of the page. Reduce the number of items in a chart. So let's say you're looking at spending across Europe. Don't show every single country. Show the ones that are of interest and then have some other resource that's available or a handout that will show here's what the scores for the rest of the countries are. It's the picture. What is the variation that tends to happen between richer countries, middle countries, and poorer countries? What are the strong attributes for this brand? What are the weak attributes for this brand? The ones in the middle, you can just call them the ones in the middle. You really don't need to show the rank ordering or the numbers that they score. And supplement the presentation with handouts. There's no reason why you shouldn't hand around about 8 sheets of paper with some key numbers and some key tables on it and say, right, I'm going to be talking about some charts. Most of the charts on the page won't have any numbers. If you want to look at the numbers, they're going to be there in the handouts. And there are some additional items in the handouts that are not on the pages. And then just move on from there. So I'd like to thank you for your time and throw it open to questions.